Trump just banned trans women from competing in sports. That'll show all 15 of them.
One final thing for today's show. LGBT activists are up in arms because President Trump just signed an executive order attempting to enforce sex segregation along biological lines in women's sports nationwide. Here's some news coverage.
Under the Trump administration, we will defend the proud tradition of female athletes, and we will not allow men to beat up, injure, and cheat our women and our girls. From now on, women's sports will be only for women. And we're putting every school receiving taxpayer dollars on notice that if you let men take over women's sports teams or invade your locker rooms, you will be investigated for violations of Title IX and risk your federal funding. Because with this executive order, the war on women's sports is over.
President Trump making good on his promise, signing an executive order keeping biological men out of women's sports.
It's pretty simple. He's saying that they want women's sports to be segregated by sex, not identity. So trans women can't compete in women's sports because biologically they are male. Trump is attempting to enforce this under Title IX, which is a law that requires educational institutions from the K-12 level to the collegiate level that receive federal funds to offer women equal opportunity to participate in sports. Their argument is that if the women's division is open to males, then women aren't being offered equal opportunity. They'll be sued in court on the legal rationale there and whether they can really implement this policy via executive order. But I've always supported this position more broadly, and I think it's just common sense that biology is what matters when it comes to sports, not identity. And women's sports exist as a separate entity for a reason, because there are important biological differences that don't fully go away. They are definitely reduced when you take estrogen or have hormone replacement therapy, but they don't fully go away. And that's why we've seen some high-profile examples of trans athletes injuring women or winning competitions. It's not the most common thing in the world, but it strikes most people, including people who are not all hateful bigots, as fundamentally unfair and wrong. So this is a massive win for Trump. It's such an issue where he looks like simultaneously the traditionalists are happy, but also a lot of feminists are happy, and just most common sense people agree with what he's doing. Then there's the Wi-Fi password movement, where many of the activists are very unhappy about this. Here are some LGBT activists who spoke to CBS News New York.
Today, I'm feeling just deeply disappointed.
Emotions of anger and disappointment echoing across the LGBTQ community Wednesday.
Instead of addressing real issues facing Americans, Trump is once again targeting the transgender community simply to score political points.
There's a lot of confusion, a lot of fear amongst trans people.
Chris Mosier is an accomplished and record-setting Nike-sponsored transgender athlete who says he's shocked but not surprised.
We are banding together to fight along with other groups, and we will continue to fight. We will continue to stand in our power, and no matter what, we will continue to exist.
So this was interesting to me because nobody said that you don't exist or that you need to stop existing. That's not a thing. We all know you exist. Trans people absolutely exist and have every right to, like anybody else. But people who are biologically male don't have a right to participate in women's sports. I'm not allowed to participate in women's sports. When I was in high school, I played on the male soccer team, not the girls soccer team, and I wasn't allowed, right? And that's not a violation of my rights. It's that it is upheld in federal law and actually required that there is a male's division and a female division. And those distinctions exist for a reason. I just don't think that acknowledging science and biological reality is inherently hateful or it violates anyone's rights. You'll see sometimes headlines and claims that Republicans are banning trans people from playing sports. That is not true. Importantly, trans boys are, from what I can tell from this executive order, still allowed to play in the boys' sports because they're only putting themselves at a disadvantage. So I've always been fine with that because they're biologically female, but they're playing with the boys. So they're at a disadvantage. They don't have an advantage. And then trans girls who are biologically male can still play sports. They just have to play in the male division, which I certainly acknowledge is uncomfortable for them and not ideal for them, and I do have some compassion and empathy for their situation, but I guess that's part of what you give up when you decide to transition. And you can't just jeopardize and compromise women's sports as an institution by eroding the important and necessary sex separation. Meanwhile, on TikTok, I keep seeing this talking point about how this is a total non-issue.
Trump just banned trans women from competing in sports. That'll show all 15 of them.
Now, part of the argument they're making here is that there aren't very many trans athletes, and they use data from the college level, the collegiate level, where, to be fair, there aren't a ton of trans women athletes. There's several dozen, though some of them are very high profile, like Leah Thomas, in ways that clearly were unfair and made other people uncomfortable. But we're not just talking about the collegiate level here. We're also talking about the high school level and elsewhere, and so it's a lot bigger than that. It's not just 10 people or 30 people or whatever they keep saying. That is a dishonest and inaccurate framing. And regardless, it's just about the principle of it. It's not fair, and it's important to reaffirm and restate biological reality. But the left-wing commentariat really lost it over this development. The Majority Report co-host Emma Vigeland shared the news that Trump signed this executive order and said, let's recreate the Tim Walz photo op, but instead of feeding children in school, how about we drive some trans kids to suicide? Wow, that is an unhinged statement. There is absolutely no evidence that sports participation rules affect suicide rates in transgender youth. There's not even evidence that medically transitioning, these treatments they say are life-saving and necessary, there's not even quality evidence of any kind showing that reduces, let alone what sports teams people can play on. So this is a really alarmist and hysterical thing, and journalists and commentators should not be talking about mental health and self-harm in these kinds of flippant and extreme ways. It's actually very bad to do that. And journalistic ethics and standards require a degree of nuance and a lack of hyperbole when you talk about such serious issues related to mental health. Notice also how, from this perspective, there's no thought given to the female athletes who lose out on opportunities or scholarships or are made to feel uncomfortable in their locker rooms by the presence of male genitalia or anything like that. No thought for how it might affect them. Just hysterical, unfounded claims about how it will affect trans kids. That really summed it up for me right there. A trans activist named Caitlin Burns also wrote about this revelation. Losing on this issue feels like my life's biggest failure. My words and scientific reality could not overcome a century of bigotry and false assumptions about trans bodies. Bruh. I know I'm supposed to be in the same community as these people, but I don't even think I'm in the same reality. Like, Caitlin, respectfully, the reason you lost on this issue and lost so hard is because you are on the opposite side of scientific reality. You're on the side that says biological sex isn't real and doesn't have meaningful differences that affect things like sports. We're on the side that is in line with scientific reality and basic biology. I just don't know how to reach these people. But frankly, while activists on the internet melted down over this news, almost all Americans support this, at least in broad strokes. Listen to CNN, yes, CNN, acknowledging that, because their own polling found almost 80% of the country agrees with, in general, limiting female sports to females.
I think these numbers are really illuminating on this topic because I just think there's such a clear trend among the American public. So transgender female athletes in women's sports, only 18% of the country says that they should be, in fact, allowed to participate in women's sports. Compare this to the opposition. I mean, my goodness gracious, 79%. You rarely get 79% of the country to agree on anything, but they do, in fact, agree on the idea of opposing transgender female athletes in women's sports. But it's not just the here and now, Laura. It's not just the here and now. What we're actually seeing is a trend on this particular issue, and it's going in the direction of opposition. So take a look here. Okay, transgendered female athletes, and amongst those Americans who oppose them in women's sports. Back in 2021, it was 62%. A majority, but, you know, not anywhere close to a ginormous majority, right? A clear majority, but not a ginormous majority. But then again, you look here in 2025, you see it at 79%. So it's not just that the majority of Americans are opposed to transgender female athletes in women's sports. It's that the opposition has become considerably larger in just the last 4 years.
Guys, this support is so extreme, there's literally no spin to be put on it. Even CNN just has to acknowledge, like, basically no one supports this radical progressive idea except the 18%. And people were asking, like, who is this 18%? I've never met them, because even a majority of Democrats, everyday Democrats, disagree with this. It's the woke people, the activists, the journalists, the San Francisco city dwellers of the world, the kinds of people whose TikToks and tweets I've been reading you. So just in broad strokes, I have to say that I think this move towards acknowledging biological reality and protecting female sports is a good thing. It's a common sense development. The specifics of the executive order and the way that Trump speaks about it are not necessarily how I would do this. Especially just doing all this via executive order does have significant drawbacks, because what can be done via executive order can be undone via executive order. One woman wrote on Twitter about Trump signing the executive order, "This is great and all, but 4 years from now, a Democratic president could be signing an EO revoking every single Trump executive order. All these wins are temporary until you can pass actual laws." This is true. If you live by executive order, you die by executive order. Not only could President Kamala Harris 2028, or God forbid, President AOC or President Jasmine Crockett, not only could they revoke Trump's order and undo this rule, they could potentially try to do the same thing in the opposite direction and require schools and collegiate athletics and other things to allow trans women, citing Title IX. And because there's no actual law clarifying this that's passed by Congress, signed by a president, and set into law, very hard to change, they might even be able to get away with that. That's why I'd really strongly prefer to see them actually pass a law. And are there really not enough people in Congress from both parties who'd be willing to join such a common sense type of thing? Maybe not. I don't know. But I do just want to add that context for you guys, that what's done by executive fiat like this can be easily undone. So it's a win, but it's potentially a fleeting one. That's just my take. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Do hit that like button. Make sure you're subscribed if you aren't yet. All right, everybody. That's it for this episode of the Brad vs. Everyone podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk again real soon.